Alrighty. This lecture is about the American elite and the origins of the CIA, and I'm going to read from one of the major sources that I used in developing this lecture, a very good book, almost impossible to find now. It went out of print almost immediately, and it only came out in 1992. It's a great book. It's called The Old Boys, subtitled The American Elite and the Origins of the CIA. It should have been called perhaps Fascism, The American Elite and the Origins of the CIA. It's authored by Burton Hirsch, and it is a great book. Now, before beginning the lecture, one point I should make is that when people think of the CIA, they think of U.S. intelligence as being the CIA. It's not. The CIA only gets 15% of the intelligence budget. The National Security Agency, in my opinion, is far more powerful than the CIA. You don't hear about it. The Defense Intelligence Agency is far more powerful than the CIA, but you don't hear about that. You don't hear about the Office of Naval Intelligence, which is at least as powerful. The Office of Special Investigations, which is Air Force Intelligence, which is very powerful. You hear about the CIA. And some people who, frankly, should know better get sucked in by this. They'll say, well, CIA, when they really mean intelligence or U.S. intelligence. So it's important to understand that the CIA is only one of America's intelligence agencies, and at least in my professional opinion, and that's shared by others, it is not the most powerful nor the most important. It is, however, very powerful. It is very important, and it's worthy of study. And one of the excellent points that Burton Hirsch makes, if you're going to study the CIA, you have to study some of the major Wall Street corporate law firms and some of the lawyers who worked for those law firms, or some of the people in the orbit of those lawyers who worked for those law firms. I'm going to be talking about those lawyers. They are going to be front and center because in many ways they are the go-getters for the American elite. And in analyzing the CIA and its penchant for lawlessness in the post-World War II period, this is also not to say that the CIA hasn't done some good things. It's difficult to give a lecture and not avoid generalities. The CIA has done a lot of really rotten things. They've also done a few good things on occasion, but in my opinion, the rotten things far outweigh the good things. This is also not to say that we don't need an intelligence service. Of course we do, and I believe that intelligence service should have a covert action capability. But in many ways, the nature of the Central Intelligence Agency as a post-World War II creature, and in particular, many of the abuses of the CIA, its violations of the Constitution abroad, its violations of the Constitution here in the United States, and in many ways, the failure of the CIA to be accountable both to the country to which that it is ostensibly serving, the United States, and also the countries that it serves up as on a platter to, or has served up, like Guatemala, Iran, and many other countries over the years, in many ways derives from the fact that at the core of our intelligence system, or at least the CIA and its predecessor, the OSS, and some of the predecessor quasi-intelligence agencies, which I'm going to talk about, are basically a bunch of high-powered Wall Street lawyers. These are attorneys. They are working for some of the major Wall Street law firms, which in turn function on behalf of some of the major American corporations in a manner not unlike the way the CIA does. Three of the names you're going to be hearing a great deal during the lecture are the name of the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, and two of the most important of the partners in Sullivan and Cromwell, who were Allen and John Foster Dulles. Sullivan and Cromwell never exerted more power in this country. It was a very powerful law firm, but during the Eisenhower administrations, you had John Foster Dulles, one of its senior partners and a dog, if ever there was one, as Secretary of State, and his brother and fellow Sullivan and Cromwell partner, Allen, as director of the CIA. And it should not come as a surprise to see the CIA doing things like overthrowing Arbenz, Jacobo Arbenz, which they did in 1954, because basically Jacobo Arbenz was reforming Guatemala. He was portrayed as a communist, and that was the rationalization for overthrowing Arbenz. Nothing could be further from the truth. The fact of the matter is, Guatemala in the early 50s was still basically a feudal society, and what Arbenz wanted to do was to convert Guatemala into a modern, market-oriented capitalist economy modeled on a North American republic known as the United States of America, which may ring a bell for some people. However, because part of that modernization process involved, we're no longer have people in attendance here. Oh well, because in reforming Guatemala, Arbenz was going to nationalize some 150,000 or maybe 120,000 acres of prime agricultural property that belonged to United Fruit, one of whose directors was Allen Dulles, and the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm was heavily involved with United Fruit. Arbenz was painted as a communist rather than a capitalist reformer, which was what he was, and he was overthrown in a brutal coup in 1954, and that set the stage for about a 40-year civil war and the formations of the first U.S. coordinated Latin American death squads and a lot of other extremely bloody and unsavory activities. But with the Eisenhower administrations and with the primacy of the two Sullivan and Cromwell partners, Allen and John Foster Dulles, occupying these positions of Secretary of State and Director of Central Intelligence, that in many ways highlighted the position of not only corporations but also of the corporate lawyers with regard to the development and operations of the CIA, which obviously are also heavily coordinated with the Department of State. It's interesting to contemplate those administrations where you've got two guys who are brothers and law partners in the same major firm, and you got one as Secretary of State and the other one's Director of the CIA. That is a serious and, in my opinion, extremely unhealthy concentration of power. Other law firms and other people whose names are going to figure in this, can you keep an eye on the people who are arriving? Not that anything suspicious about them, but our staff is gone here. The law firm of Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn is another very powerful Wall Street law firm. And another of the names that you're going to be hearing, a fellow named Frank Wisner, a corporate lawyer, Wall Street lawyer, partner in Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, who was a key functionary for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. He then went on to become a key CIA official and the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence during the period when Allen, at least for a while, was CIA Director. Eventually, Wisner began experiencing some psychological difficulties, so he left. But at one point, you had at the same time as you had Eisenhower and John Foster, you had Allen and John Foster Dulles as the two key partners in as Secretary of State and Director of CIA, and you also had these two who had previously been key Sullivan and Cromwell partners. You had two deputy directors of Central Intelligence, with the aforementioned Frank Wisner and Harding Jackson, both of whom were partners in the Carter, Ledyard, Milburn law firm. So again, when I'm talking about the Wall Street lawyers here, we're talking about something which is absolutely central to an understanding of the operations of the CIA. And in order to really launch the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the history of what is literally an old boy network. I was schmoozing earlier about the term conspiracy theory and how loaded it is and the connotations that it dredges up. A much more intelligent way, I think, of expressing and understanding some of these processes, which are frankly conspiratorial, would be to refer to them as what they are, which is networking. You know, you say, well, how about conspiracy theory? People go, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. And you say, well, how about networking? And they go, networking. Oh, you mean what yuppies do? Oh, you mean what I do? Why, yes, how nice. That's delightful. Because that's exactly what you're talking about. It's not only networking in terms of these people promoting themselves and each other into positions of power, but the very nature of the CIA itself and many of its abuses, its insular nature with regard to not only the society it is ostensibly serving, the United States, but also the countries that have been the beneficiaries, and that's to a large extent a sarcastic term, of its activities. The CIA, for example, went in, bulldozed Guatemala, and the bulldozing of Guatemala did not benefit the United States. It did benefit United Fruit, and it didn't benefit the people of Guatemala either. However, the people that did it were not really concerned with the welfare of either the United States or Guatemala. They were concerned with the welfare of United Fruit and Sullivan and Cromwell. And the insular nature of the CIA and also much of its methodology in many ways derives from the fact that at the foundation of the CIA and at the foundation of our civilian intelligence services were these very powerful Wall Street lawyers. And there's a very good passage, it's a superb book, it's a very good passage in The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch, which analyzes this, and I think rather than attempt to paraphrase it, I'm going to read it to you directly because it's a very eloquent and substantive launching point for the discussion. Another of the people we're going to be talking about is William Wild Bill Donovan, who was an officer in the Rainbow Division in World War I, and then went on to move up through the Wall Street elite and became a very, very influential figure throughout the period between the World Wars, and in many ways he was sort of the godfather of the U.S. intelligence system. And Burton Hirsch writes in The Old Boys as follows: "The same year Henry Luce laid claim to the 1900s, an extraordinarily nimble," that's referring to Henry Luce, who dubbed the 20th century the American century. "The same year Henry Luce laid claim to the 1900s, an extraordinarily nimble New York antitrust attorney named William J. Wild Bill Donovan inveigled Franklin Roosevelt into underwriting the first encompassing intelligence instrumentality, the Office of the Coordinator of Information. Donovan's profession was relevant, corporate lawyer, and it is equally no accident that all three load-bearing protagonists throughout this work, Bill Donovan, Allen Dulles, and Frank Wisner, achieved status in America by way of important Wall Street law partnerships. In many ways, a trusted corporate attorney accomplishes substantially for his clients what today's one-step national intelligence factory goes after for its patron. He puts the deals together, he damps down crises and flaps, he keeps the process as confidential as possible. He finds out everything he can and resorts to every means imaginable to shape the outcome. He proceeds by the case system and preferably one emergency at a time. Furthermore, an intelligence service concocted by lawyers, men accustomed not merely to spotting the problems, which I would add parenthetically is the traditional role of intelligence, to serve as the eyes and ears for a society, particularly for its military. Beginning again. Furthermore, an intelligence service concocted by lawyers, men accustomed not merely to spotting the problems, but also to defining them to their clients and recommending appropriate action, is far more likely than a traditional military intelligence staff to reach in and condition policy. Attorneys have a seductive way of subordinating their clients, of insinuating their ledger domain until they become the movers. And thus it develops that in many strategic entanglements, the lawyers have at least as much control over the outcome as elected officials. And I think as a metaphor, we can look for the parallel functions of not only Wall Street lawyers, but also the Central Intelligence Agency. And again, I think that Burton Hirsch has seized on a very important element of an analysis. So why the CIA has functioned in the way it functions, which is not necessarily the same as the way other intelligence services function, and indeed some of the areas in which it has been engaged. One thing Burton Hirsch also writes about, and others who have honestly portrayed the development of our intelligence services have written about, and something that I'm going to be talking about, and that is the development of fascism. Many of my lectures overlap each other, and this lecture will be no exception, because in analyzing not only the genesis of our Central Intelligence Agency, but in analyzing the geopolitical machinations of many of these individuals and many of these law firms, we see them inextricably linked with the development of international fascism, both prior to and after the Second World War. Very good place to begin. Now remember, the key term here is networking, because that's what we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be looking at the development of many of these luminaries who helped to shape the foundation and functioning of the CIA, and we're going to watch how they developed during the course of the 20th century. And a very good place to begin, both in terms of analyzing this networking and also in terms of coming to understand the forces that helped to shape the development of the U.S. intelligence system, how American-based transnational corporations and the law firms that served them play into this process, and that is to examine the world at the end of World War I. The world changed a lot during the First World War, and the imprimatur that was put on the post-World War I world was in many ways established at Versailles, and we see many of these key figures moving in and out of the Versailles Peace Conference. Perhaps peace belongs in quotes, because it ultimately led not only to more war but to a worse war. I do think that the German national claim of injustice at the Versailles Treaty is just. I think that the Versailles Treaty was stupid, predictably so perhaps, but it could only have led to an aggravated and therefore resurgent Germany, ultimately Nazi Germany. But the world changed an awful lot during the First World War. When the World War began, In 1914, Europe was dominated by major monarchies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire under the Habsburgs, the Wilhelminian dynasty in Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm, and of course the Romanovs in what was then the Russian Empire. By the end of that war, 4 years later, all three of those monarchies had dissolved. The world's first Marxist state, the Soviet Union, had come into being, and that absolutely sent shockwaves throughout the industrialized world and had much to do with not only shaping the nature of the machinations that went on at Versailles, but a lot that went on between the two world wars, and it had much to do with shaping the post-World War II world as well. We should note that not only did the Soviet Union come into being, we should note too, as the right wing gains power in the United States, and we see the patriots and militia networks gaining X amount of access, and we hear this stuff about the Jewish banking conspiracy and the protocols of the elders of Zion is now making a comeback. Not many people know that the American ruling class, the American elite, frankly, does have a very definite ethnic and religious affiliation. Most people don't know about it. People who are powerful generally learn to keep their name out of the papers. It's one of the best ways for preserving and maintaining power. The American ruling class, the American elite, is Episcopalian. You never hear about, those Episcopalians, right? They are very, very... George Bush epitomizes the American elite. He's Episcopalian. The Episcopalian Church is basically the American branch of the old Anglican Church. And when you hear about the Eastern Establishment, for example, or the Ivy League schools, which are, frankly, as someone that went through institutions of that kind, the educational standards within in the Northeast culture are much higher than they are elsewhere in the country, particularly in California. And there are some good schools such as Stanford out here. The intellectual standards that are maintained by the Ivy League and related schools, such as the Little Three, places like Haverford that you're going to hear about, are way beyond the intellectual standards and the academic standards that are maintained for even the best West Coast, Midwest, and Southern educational institutions. This is not in any way to be a chauvinist, but rather the American elite. I don't like the term ruling class because it smacks of Marxist ideology, which I don't particularly care for, but it is, frankly, a ruling class, and they do have a very definite affiliation. It isn't the Jews, unquote, it's the Episcopalians. But you never hear about that. There's a very good book called The Power of Their Glory, written by a husband and wife team, both of whose last names begin with L and whose names I've forgotten off the top of my head. But you never hear people talk about, the Illuminati, or, the Jews this, the Jews that, or the commies this, or the commies that, or the liberals this, and the liberals that. You never hear American analysts talking about those Episcopalians, those damned Episcopalians. That is a very, very powerful, self-referential, and ingrown elite, and the degree of influence that they have wielded over this country's history is genuinely shocking. That is who controls the Wall Street Eastern Establishment. That is who controls the Ivy League schools, and they network. George Bush epitomizes the American ruling class, the Episcopalian ruling class. He's Episcopalian, went to Yale, comes from a long line of industrialists and financiers who, by the way, had collaborated with Nazi Germany in World War II, appears to have worked for the CIA from the moment he graduated from Yale. George Bush epitomizes the American elite, or ruling class, if you prefer. To give you an idea of how profound their control is, when Dwight Eisenhower left the Army, and he was an international hero, particularly a national hero, and a 5-star general in the Army, between the time that he left his commission and the time he was elected president, he served as president of Columbia University in New York, which is part of the Ivy League, and which was also the epicenter of our first semi-official, it was actually unofficial intelligence service that was put together by Woodrow Wilson called the Inquiry. It was actually more of an advisory board, but it actually sort of functioned as an intelligence service, and it was based at Columbia University. Dwight Eisenhower was not an Episcopalian, and they actually had to have a special meeting, a special convocation of the trustees of Columbia University, because this was the first time in that university's history that a non-Episcopalian had been president. This was considered such a radical departure at the time, this was the early 1950s, that a special meeting of the Board of Trustees of Columbia University had to be convened to see whether it was okay to have, a Swedish, German-American 5-star general whose credentials were not viewed as necessarily being pure enough for the Episcopalian elite. The Boston Brahmins, which one may hear reference to, were the Episcopalian elite. The saying in the mid-19th century had it that Boston was run by these Brahmins, as they were called, and the expression ran that Boston was where the Lowells speak only to the Cabots, and the Cabots speak only to God. And that is the American elite, the American Episcopalian ruling class to a T. Now, at the Versailles Treaty, we should understand that the three monarchies which had dominated continental Europe had been overthrown. New nations were in the process of agitating into coming into being. There was no such thing as Yugoslavia. There was no such thing as Czechoslovakia. And I would note that at the end of the Cold War, both of those countries promptly disappeared and are now being gobbled up by Germany and its sphere of influence. Plus, in addition to the fact that the Bolshevik Revolution had established the world's first Marxist state, by the way, we're also hearing, this is something of an aside, where as the Cold War recedes and as political reaction and, frankly, fascism gains steam in the United States, we're hearing more about, the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy and how the Wall Street Jews financed the Bolshevik Revolution. In RFA 37, I advanced my working hypothesis, and I think it'll bear considerable scrutiny, that in fact one of the things that has made the German power politicians and geopoliticians so successful in this century is that they were able to look beyond the issue of class struggle. And they have used communism and anti-communism as vehicles for conquest. A lot of people forget. You hear about the Jews having, started. You hear a lot of this kind of stuff, and certainly people in Southern California are probably not strangers to these kinds of arguments. You hear about the Jews financed the Bolshevik Revolution, did that and the other thing. How did Lenin get back into Russia to start the Bolshevik Revolution? He was shipped in by the German General Staff, is how he got in there, because he had promised to take Russia out of the First World War, which he did. It was a strategic move. They then, that is to say, the Germans then used fear of communism and Bolshevism in the period between the wars to garner favor from the Allies. We're going to talk about what went on between the world wars. And then in the aftermath of World War II, once again, fear of communism was actively utilized by the Germans in order to gain strategic advantage. But it's really funny to hear. I take calls from time to time on my program in Northern California. People go, well, how come you never talk about all the Jews and all the power they won, this, that, and the other thing? Well, again, you hear about Jews, but you don't hear about the Episcopalian elite. But well, how about, I had a fellow call me up about a year and a half ago saying, you never talk about the Jews having started the Bolshevik Revolution. I said, there's a reason for that. They didn't start the Bolshevik Revolution, although because the Tsarist regime was extremely anti-Semitic, many Jews were very supportive of it, because the Tsar was a brute and he was an anti-Semite, and so using the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, they supported it, because it was a way of getting the sabers off of the backs of their necks. But you never hear, most people forget that, in fact, Lenin was shipped back into Russia in a sealed boxcar by the Imperial German General Staff, and it was very successful, a very successful ploy. He promptly withdrew Russia from World War II, then World War I rather. They set up the USSR, and things proceed from there. Even as the guns were falling silent in Europe after World War I, the shape of the next conflict was taking place, and some of the networking, that term again, was already taking place, the networking which was to shape not only the development of fascism, the development of the Second World War, but what came out of it. This was already taking place. We should also remember that in addition to the fact that the Soviet Union had come into being, and here again, at the end of the century, we are so accustomed to the reality of having a big Marxist state that it may be difficult for people to understand what a shock this was to have this old monarchy, this huge imperial empire, suddenly go Bolshevik. It sent shockwaves throughout the industrialized world and had a profound influence. Plus, there were other socialist or Marxist revolutions elsewhere in Europe of varying degrees of success. A fellow named Bela Kun acceded to power in Hungary for a time, although he was later dispatched by force of arms. There were also a series of abortive Marxist uprisings in Germany as well. They too were put down by force of arms. But it's worth understanding what was, in fact, it's necessary to understand what was going on at the end of World War I, and some of the people that were already beginning to play a role as movers and shakers, not only on the international power political scene, but on the Wall Street scene in particular. One of the people whose views were subverted at Versailles was Woodrow Wilson. He was, of course, President of the United States as World War I was drawing to a close, and he was also the prime architect of the League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, which was ostensibly at least going to prevent another bloodletting of the nature of World War I. It's interesting that Woodrow Wilson himself was in favor of a relatively inclusive and moderate position toward the former Soviet Union, because it was his belief that if the Soviet Union was established as a pariah nation, if it was formally set aside from the family of nations, that this would make the Bolsheviks themselves more militant, more hostile, that it would make them more inclined to try to spread their revolutionary creed throughout the world. If, on the other hand, in Wilson's view, and also in the view of some other relatively observant people, if the former Soviet Union had been included in the family of nations and had not been treated as a pariah nation, this would not only lead to commercial ties, but in time to a softening of diplomatic and political attitudes on the part of the Soviets and those who opposed them. There's considerable evidence that this was in fact the case. Now, one of the old boys, one of the members of the American elite, whom we're going to be hearing about a little later, because one of the epicenters for the development of these networks, and again that term networking, was a fellow named William Bullitt, last name B-U-L-L-I-T-T. Bullitt was a Philadelphia aristocrat. Much of the American elite, by the way, was housed and moved in and out of what was known as the Main Line in Philadelphia. Aside from Boston and Wall Street, if one wanted to locate an epicenter for the American elite, it would be Philadelphia. Again, this is not something a lot of people are familiar with, but if you wanted to study the evolution of the American elite, study the Philadelphia Main Line and the blue bloods who move in and out of there. William Bullitt was one of these. He was an ambitious young diplomat. And Bullitt, during the period when the Versailles Conference was underway, Bullitt visited the former Soviet Union and was talking with Lenin, and had actually worked out a rapprochement, an agreement with Lenin, whereby the expeditionary forces which had invaded the Soviet Union at the end of World War I, this is something a lot of people forget about, is that as soon as the Soviet Union came into being and World War I ended, there took place the War of the 14 Nations. I've also heard it said 13 nations. It's just it's a matter of head count. But the War of the 13 or 14 nations took place when a number of different countries, including Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, invaded the former Soviet Union in an attempt to restore the Tsar or the Kerensky government, which held power briefly in between the fall of the Tsar and the Bolshevik Revolution. Kerensky was a relatively conservative social democrat. When the Tsar was kicked out, he basically said ta-ta to the Tsar, but he kept Russia in the World War I, which was something that was anathema to the vast majority of people in the former Russian Empire. We're familiar with the loss of life that the Soviets incurred in World War II. They lost 10 million in World War I as well, when it was not, of course, the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of bloodshed, and World War I was not popular inside of Imperial Russia. But William Bullitt had actually worked out an agreement with Lenin whereby if the anti-Soviet forces withdrew and if the support for some of the white Russian reactionaries such as Admiral Kolchak was withdrawn, then basically Lenin was going to allow much of what eventually became the Soviet Union to remain under the control of anti-Soviet forces. Had the Bullitt-Lenin agreement been allowed to take fruit, it was overridden by Wilson and some other diplomats who basically, as near as I can tell, were angry. Some of them were so militantly anti-communist that they couldn't stand the idea of any sort of Marxist state remaining in existence. And a lot of them were just pissed off, basically, because William Bullitt had stolen a march on them in the jockeying for achievement and consequent prestige and power. Wilson eventually overrode William Bullitt and said basically that this agreement was not going to be binding. And that had much to do with hardening the Soviets' attitude at that point. But it's interesting to contemplate what a different world we would be living in if the Bullitt-Lenin agreement had been allowed to stand. Most of the Ukraine, for example, would not have been in the Soviet Union. It would have remained as an independent state, and a relatively militantly anti-communist one at that. Quote, containing, unquote, the Soviet Union would have been relatively easy with an independent and anti-communist Ukraine, which would have been one of the outgrowths of the Bullitt-Lenin negotiations. But they were overridden, and that in many ways set the stage for what was taking place a little bit later. Now, we should also note that not only during the period of the Versailles Conference, but the immediate aftermath of Versailles, there were a number of things going on which were to shape the world between the two world wars and the course of the Second World War, and which were to profoundly influence what came out of World War II as well. In 1919, for example, Germany was to a large extent in a state of civil war. There were paramilitary organizations, the Freikorps, the Einwohnerwehren, and the Zeitfreiwilligenverbände, which were put together for the purposes of suppressing the aborted Bolshevik revolutions in various parts of Germany. One of the individuals who was functioning as an undercover operative for the political department of the German army was a young Austrian-born corporal named Adolf Hitler, who was already functioning as an undercover agent for German military intelligence in the late teens. He infiltrated, for example, the abortive Marxist revolution in the Munich area, posed as one of the revolutionaries, and then when the German troops liberated Munich from the communists, Hitler then basically showed his true colors, fingered all the leaders of the revolution, who were then taken out and shot. He then infiltrated, on orders of General von Lossow, his commander, he then infiltrated a moribund political party in the Munich area called the German Socialist Workers' Party, and along with other Reichswehr intelligence agents and pan-German propagandists, it was renamed the German National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. It was in its inception a front for German military intelligence and a vehicle for introducing the supposedly demobilized German army into civilian society for the purpose of fomenting political reaction. We should note that in 1919, the papal nuncio to Munich, Archbishop Eugenio Pacelli, later and better known as Pope Pius XII, was channeling Vatican money to Adolf Hitler in Germany in 1919. And it was in 1919 as well that John Foster Dulles, then an up-and-coming attorney with the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm, made contact with Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, a German-American financier who went on to become the first and most prominent finance minister of Nazi Germany. He was named after Horace Greeley, the famous American journalist who coined the phrase, "Go West, young man," which is something an awful lot of the Third Reich alumni wound up doing in the wake of World War II in the institution of the Gehlen Organization. We should note, however, that in 1919, as William Bullitt's diplomatic overtures to Lenin, initially very successful but later overridden, were being made, other hot shots in the American elite and the American power establishment were already jockeying to reshape the power politics of Europe in such a way as to conduct an anti-Soviet crusade. And people like John Foster Dulles and others who were of a similar mind were already in 1919 concerned with rebuilding German industry in order to use Germany as a vehicle for certainly preventing the spread of communism across Europe, and ultimately, ideally in their viewpoint, for deep-sixing the Soviet Union. It was in 1919 that John Foster Dulles made contact with Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht. It was in 1919 that the Vatican was actively funding Adolf Hitler. And the seeds for what was to take place were already being sown in 1919 during the course of the Versailles Treaty. And it's important to understand that already, even as the guns were falling silent in Europe for World War I, the power political situation in Europe and in America was being rearranged in such a way as to make, at least in my opinion, the resumption of hostilities, which later became known as World War II, inevitable. It's also worth understanding that in 1920, a young corporate attorney who had served with great heroism, although somewhat unwisely in the view of some, in World War I, a fellow named William Wild Bill Donovan, an Irish-American who had commanded a regiment known as the Fighting 69th, or the 69th, also known as the Fighting Harps. It was largely composed of Irish-Americans, and it was part of what was known as the Rainbow Division. This was one of America's major divisions in World War I. And it was, interestingly enough, during the First World War and in the context of the operations of the Rainbow Division, that the rivalry between William Donovan, who earned his nickname of Wild Bill during World War I, because he was a fairly flamboyant and reckless character and a very brave one, not necessarily the most strategically far-sighted person, but he developed a rivalry with one of the commanding officers of the Rainbow Division, Douglas MacArthur. And that rivalry was to ripen over the years, and during the Second World War it grew so intense that Douglas MacArthur actively frustrated OSS operations in the Pacific Theater during World War II. We'll touch on that perhaps a little bit later. One of the things that had spurred the rivalry between MacArthur and Donovan, both of which, by the way, were very close to the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group. Now, as we analyze the American elite and the Wall Street elite, it's worth understanding the position played by the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group. To make a long story short, capitalist entrepreneurs fall into two basic classes: industrial capitalists and finance capitalists. The difference, I think, should be rather apparent. Morgan was involved with both, but in particular, the Morgan Bank was involved with financing a number of very significant American industrial undertakings, including, for example, the DuPont's putting together of General Motors. The DuPont family controlled General Motors for many years. It was put together in order to establish a viable rival to help take some of the automobile market in this country away from Henry Ford. Also, by the way, one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most prominent financial backers. Henry Ford was channeling money to Hitler in the late teens and early 20s, and entire sections of Mein Kampf are believed to have been taken almost verbatim from Henry Ford's anti-Semitic newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, later collated into a volume called the International Jew, which is now once again making a comeback in certain right-wing circles, certain quasi-white supremacists and people associated with some of the more venal networks within the patriots and militia groups, as I've indicated in the past, a mixed bag, are once again beginning to circulate Henry Ford's The International Jew, which was one of the influences on Mein Kampf. But J.P. Morgan was a profoundly influential figure, and the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group wielded an incalculable influence in the United States and continues to. J.P. Morgan, a key Morgan partner, Edward Stotesbury, married his daughter off to an up-and-coming general staff officer named Douglas MacArthur. And the relationship between the Morgan Group, by the way, Stotesbury was once again a member of the Philadelphia Main Line that I alluded to earlier. That relationship between MacArthur and the Morgan Group had much to do with MacArthur's rise through the ranks. MacArthur was one of the commanders, one of the top officers with the Rainbow Division in World War I, and he had laid a very careful trap for German troops during the course of the combat, and then the key to the trap was to have the Fighting 69th, commanded by William Donovan, occupy a particular position and engage German troops. Then the Fighting 69th was to withdraw, leading the German troops pursuing it into a trap, which MacArthur was going to close. Well, Wild Bill Donovan was long on courage, long on moxie, and short on strategy, and was a bit of an independent operator. He disobeyed the orders to fall back, which not only got much of his regiment killed. The Fighting 69th did not do well in World War I. Their victory parade when they came home was considerably smaller than when they had left, because they got creamed, basically. And one of the reasons they got creamed, by the way, one of the people who lost his life while serving for Donovan in this engagement was the very famous, or at least at the time, very famous poet Joyce Kilmer. But Donovan's orders were to fall back, and he didn't. Instead, he disobeyed orders, tried to hold the position and, teach the Huns a lesson, and spoiled MacArthur's trap. And from that point forward, MacArthur and Wild Bill Donovan were bitter enemies, and ultimately that rivalry was to considerably shape the course of intelligence and military operations in the Pacific theater during World War II. We'll touch on that a little bit later. In 1920, however, J.P. Morgan, who was very concerned over the political developments in Europe, dispatched Wild Bill Donovan on a fact-finding mission and, according to some sources, also a mission to channel funds to reactionary political parties in Germany. Bear in mind that the Kaiser, the Hohenzollern dynasty, had been overthrown. The Kaiser had abdicated, and Germany was in a state of virtual civil war in the Weimar Republic. There were abortive Marxist revolutions. There were also abortive fascist revolutions, such as the Kapp Putsch of 1922, an abortive fascist coup that was put together largely by naval officers. And in 1920, J.P. Morgan dispatched Wild Bill Donovan, as he was already becoming known, to Europe on what was partially a fact-finding mission to basically reconnoiter Europe and the political situation there, and also, according to some sources, to channel J.P. Morgan monies to reactionary political parties in Germany. One writer has maintained that Donovan channeled $1 million from J.P. Morgan to right-wing political parties in Germany in 1920. We should bear in mind that $1 million, it's still a nice chunk of change. I wouldn't mind having $1 million on hand, but $1 million in 1920 was a lot of money. That was a great deal of money. And so if $1 million were being channeled to reactionary political parties in Germany by J.P. Morgan in 1920, as some sources claim, that would have, in and of itself, helped to alter the political climate in Germany. When Wild Bill Donovan got home from this particular mission, he used his commission from J.P. Morgan to basically found his own Wall Street law firm, Donovan Leisure, and I've forgotten the other part. Irvine was another of them, Irvine. and that law firm survives to this day. But its genesis as a major Wall Street law firm came out of the founding funds, the seed money, was the commission that J.P. Morgan paid to Wild Bill Donovan to go to Europe to not only reconnoiter, but also, according to some sources, to channel monies to the fledgling reactionary political parties in Germany. Whether the Nazi Party under Hitler was one of those, I do not know. It should be noted that there were a number of fascist political parties in Germany in the 20s. One was called the Stahlhelm, for example, the steel helmet. So there were a number of different parties vying for the leadership in German political reaction. As it happened, Hitler and his NSDAP was the party that won out. So in 1920, we should note that Wild Bill Donovan, already acting as a proxy for J.P. Morgan, was sticking his nose into Europe and not only helping to size up the situation for Morgan, but also to channel, according to some sources, channel reactionary political monies throughout Europe in order to help alter the political situation. Now, one of the things that also grew out of the Treaty of Versailles, in addition to the deep sixing of the Bullitt-Lenin negotiations, and by the way, one of the things that's interesting, too, is that although Bullitt was fiercely anti-communist, he also was very pro-William Bullitt, and he saw that if he could pull off this coup with Lenin, this diplomatic coup with Lenin, this would basically boost his A blank blank into a position of great prestige with regard to his subsequent diplomatic and financial career. Again, the term networking is one that I want to float to you at this time. It's fascinating to observe that as many of these players were helping to shape the fate of nations and taking actions which were ultimately to cost millions of people their lives and to precipitate some of the bloodiest and most costly events in human history, that these people were basically had one eye on their credit rating and another eye on the mirror, admiring themselves, and careerism and networking were throughout this scenario. And ultimately, some of the outgrowths of this careerism and networking were to result in, to a certain extent at least, fascism and the Second World War. Now, one of the injustices of the Versailles Treaty, and I personally view the treatment of Germany at Versailles as unjust. I certainly have no brief for German fascism or German authoritarianism, but the fact of the matter is World War I was not the Germans' fault. It was partly their fault, but all of the imperial nations were basically getting ready for a major tussle. Germany was relatively late on the national scene, having really been coalesced into a nation by von Bismarck in the mid-19th century, and Germany was hoping to force a realignment of the distribution of colonial territories, and it was no secret that there was going to be a major war in Europe, and it was just a question of when and how it got started. I do not think that Germany bore any more war guilt, so to speak, than any of the other nations. They certainly didn't bear any less as well. However, at the Treaty of Versailles, they were saddled with the guilt for World War I. This had much to do with shaping the nature of German political reaction in the 1920s, and a series of what, at least for the average German, and note that, a series of what, for the average German, were very costly reparations payments were made. Now, the reparations, it should be noted, did not hurt the German elite. They really did not hurt the landed aristocracy, the Junkers. They did not hurt the German industrialists and financiers. Screwed the hell, along with the runaway German inflation of the 1920s, out of the average German. The working class got ground into grist, the middle class ceased to exist, and this had much to do with fueling German reaction. There are those analysts who maintain that the runaway German inflation and the subsequent stabilization of the mark were largely engineered by Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, who later was to become the most prominent of a number of finance ministers that Hitler had serving under him. One of the things that took place at Versailles was as I said, the imposition of a series of reparations payments and a series of a series of conditions on Germany, which fueled German hatred and German reaction. In addition to the incorporation of the Saar, a very important mining and industrial region of Germany, into France, the Germans were saddled with a series of very costly reparations payments to the victorious nations in World War I. In order to accomplish the goal that some of the American elite, people like John Foster Dulles, people like William Bullitt, some of the other people that we're going to be talking about, people like William Donovan, in order to effect the goal that they were already looking to establish in 1919 during the Versailles Conference, namely the rebuilding of German industry in order to reestablish Germany as the major player in Central Europe, to act as a bulwark against the spread of communism across continental Europe, and also ultimately, at least in my opinion, to utilize Germany as a vehicle for deep sixing the Soviet Union. Did we just turn it over there, Tim? Okay. Now again, for the benefit. By the way, for those of you who may have arrived late, this talk is being taped, and you can purchase a copy at the end of the discussion from She Who Remembers, and also He Who Helps Her Remember, who's right over there. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles imposed a series of reparations payments on Germany, which were very costly to Germany. We should note that many of the diplomats slash lawyers slash elite who were involved with setting up the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations payments also were to play a very prominent part in a series of loans and the floating of a series of securities on the American capital market, which were designed to counteract the very reparations payments which some of them had helped to arrange. Foster Dulles, for example, was opposed to the reparations payments, although some of the other American elite were in favor of the reparations payments. But John Foster Dulles was front and center in setting up a series of loans to Germany. Now, Germany was badly in need of investment capital in the mid-1920s. For the goal of the American elite to be realized, namely the reestablishment of Germany as a major industrial power, the shoring up of German industry, and the institution of Germany as a watch, as a mainspring of political reaction in Central Europe, a couple of loans programs, the Dawes and Young program, were set up. These provided for a series of loans to be made both to German municipalities and to German corporations. In particular, the shape of German heavy industry between the world wars and also to a certain extent after the wars, after World War II, was shaped by these loans. As a result of the recapitalization of Germany under the Dawes and Young plan, three huge cartels grew up. One of them was the IG Farben cartel, literally Interessengemeinschaft Farben Industry, which was a consolidation of the German dyestuffs and chemical industries. Perhaps dye in this case could be a pun. It obviously refers to DYE, that you use to dye clothing, but ultimately they were inextricably linked, and they were the mainspring of German war industry in World War II, in which case in which situation they became the manufacturers of the dye stuffs, DIE stuffs, because it helped a lot of people to dye. IG Farben was one of the companies that grew out of the loans that were made under the Dawes and Young plans. Also, AEG, German General Electric, Allgemeine Elektrizitätsgesellschaft, my German is flawed, and Vereinigte Stahlwerke. By the way, that was 30% owned by General Electric, the U.S. General Electric. No longer the case, although AEG is still in existence, or was for much of the post-World War II period. General Electric, also one of the major beneficiaries of Morgan Capital. The other of the three cartels was Vereinigte Stahlwerke, or United Steel, with strong capital participation by, once again, American industry, including the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group. By the way, in 1934, the Morgan Group was the principal element involved in an abortive fascist coup against Franklin Roosevelt. The American elite, again, were outraged by Franklin Roosevelt, who was one of them. He was part of the Episcopalian ruling class. He might actually have been Presbyterian. He was part of the American Protestant elite, and he was viewed as someone whose elevation to political power should serve the interests of the class from which he came. But he was viewed as a traitor to his class. Actually, in all likelihood, it was Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal which prevented a possible Marxist revolution in the United States. Whether it would have succeeded militarily is anybody's guess, but one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt did with the New Deal, which was viewed as absolute heresy by the American elite, was to win the allegiance of much of the American progressive establishment and the American working class away from the very powerful and influential Communist Party of the USA. Because Franklin Roosevelt, in many ways, and in my opinion, could be viewed not as the traitor to capitalism that the elite viewed him, but as the man who in many ways saved capitalism in North America, because the Great Depression did not exactly set most American working people to doing the varsity rag, and they were much more receptive, with the former Soviet Union enjoying full employment for all of its other shortcomings. When people were starving and their families were starving, the idea of full employment looked pretty damn good, and the power and influence of the American Communist Party was considerable, almost unimaginably large to those of us in the 1990s. The influence of the American Communist Party in the 1930s could not be exaggerated. It was very powerful, particularly among the unions and among American workers. And in my opinion, Franklin Roosevelt, in all likelihood, literally outflanked the American Communist Party and could be viewed quite literally as the savior of capitalism in North America. The elite didn't see it that way. They viewed him as a traitor to his class, so they tried to overthrow him in 1934 and to set up a corporate state along the lines of Mussolini's corporate state in Italy. Mussolini founded the term fascism. He was the world's first fascist, and he, when queried by journalists, he described fascism as corporatism or as reaction. This obviously sat well with the corporate elite. There's nothing they liked better than the idea of corporatism or a corporate state. As was the case in Germany, Mussolini was propped up by American capital. It should be noted, though, that front and center in the 1934 coup attempt were members of the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group, including and especially the DuPont Company. The DuPonts at that point owned General Motors. They controlled Remington, which was a DuPont property, a major munitions manufacturer, is to this day. Remington Ammunition, along with Winchester and a few others, is one of the major marketers of ammunition to the American firearms community. The Morgan Industrial and Financial Group tried to overthrow Roosevelt in 1934. Their first choice, by the way, as the man to head up the 1934 coup was none other than Douglas MacArthur. Bear in mind that MacArthur was the son-in-law of a key Morgan Philadelphia mainline partner, Edward Stotesbury, as I indicated earlier. But we should note that the Morgan finagling in this regard reached a peak, at least in the United States, in 1934. Now, Germany needed industrial capital, needed investment capital. America had it. Germany was viewed as an ideal investment climate because a dollar invested in Germany in the early and mid-1920s would yield a very significant return on that investment. And so as a series of loans was being arranged to Germany, many of the beneficiaries of the capital loan to Germany on the American side were many of these very same Wall Street law firms. Now, the special counsel to the Dawes Committee, which arranged the the reparations loan under the Dawes Plan, along with the Young Plan, the first of these two plans, was none other than John Foster Dulles, who again was one of the top lawyers with the Sullivan and Cromwell law firm. Ultimately, Sullivan and Cromwell went on to handle much of the legal business in the United States for many of the most powerful German corporations, corporations which were not only to elevate Adolf Hitler politically, something that was viewed with considerable favor by much of the Wall Street elite, but they were also to provide the backbone of German war industry during the course of the Second World War. Companies like I.G. Farben, companies like the Schroeder Company, companies like IT&T were inextricably linked not only with each other, but with many of their American corporate counterparts and with the law firms which handled the legal business and which made many of the arrangements for these American corporations. Sullivan and Cromwell's influence in 20th century America and around the world could not be exaggerated. Sullivan and Cromwell, and in particular John Foster Dulles, were heavily involved with financing political reaction around the world through some of these corporations. Sullivan and Cromwell was very close to the Bank of Spain, which was a Franco bank under Francisco Franco. They did a lot of work with fascist Italy as well. But the main clients of Sullivan and Cromwell, for the purposes of the present discussion, were the German corporations, in particular some of the giant cartels such as I.G. Farben, which were not only to elevate Adolf Hitler politically, but which were also to provide the backbone of German war-making industry, and which were also the beneficiaries of very lenient treatment because of these corporate connections before, during, and after World War II. One of the corporations that we'll want to bear in mind as we proceed through this story is the International Telephone and Telegraph, IT&T. Very powerful corporation around the world. IT&T was heavily involved, for example, with the German electrical industry. Much of the German electrical grid came from IT&T prior to and during World War II, and most of what didn't come from IT&T came from German General Electric. Again, AEG, 30% owned by the Morgan-connected American General Electric as well. Ultimately, the corporation that was to boost Ronald Reagan into political prominence as well. IT&T, its head, Sosthenes Bain, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, I've never heard it spoken around. Sosthenes is his first name, last name Behn, was an ardent anti-communist and one of the architects of the fascist political reaction which was to ultimately precipitate World War II, and which was intended originally as sort of they were intended, the fascists, as not only anti-communist enforcers in their own countries, but ultimately as Western industries hitmen against the Soviet Union. That planning actually went as far back as 1919. By the way, despite the fact, just a parenthetical aside here, despite the fact that this is relatively well documented, longtime listeners to my program are familiar with the fact that I'm very critical of the so-called progressive forces in this country. country. That's why I call them so-called. You try talking about the American financing of fascism, and in particular the relatively early date at which some of these key players were already envisioning Germany as the bulwark against communism. And let me tell you, you will find yourself to be a very lonely man or woman. Indeed, you'll find that a lot of the people that are out there trumpeting the progressive agenda, quote unquote, and the most loudly, won't touch this with a 10-foot pole. You see how few will deal with the corporate connections to fascism. Very, very few indeed. IT&T was one of the major corporations involved in this, a transnational corporation. IT&T at one point acquired a controlling interest in the Lorenz Company, which in turn owned Focke-Wulf, one of the top German combat aircraft manufacturers. Focke-Wulf manufactured one of the top German combat planes, the Focke-Wulf. An awful lot of American airmen died at the hands of the FW-190 during the air war over Europe in World War II. The Focke-Wulf was owned by the Lorenz Company, which was an ITT subsidiary. One of the directors of the German subsidiary of IT&T was a fellow who we're going to hear about later named Walter Schellenberg. Walter Schellenberg was in charge of overseas intelligence for the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst. That was the SS intelligence service. Schellenberg, again a key SS intelligence officer, was a director of the German subsidiary of IT&T, and throughout the entire course of World War II, while running overseas intelligence for the SS, he was being paid a director's salary out of New York, again to indicate how profound some of these connections are. By way of underscoring the sympathy that fascism was viewed by the American elite, Mussolini, for example, was made an honorary member of the American Legion in 1935. In 1931, Smedley Butler, who was a Marine Corps Major General, a two-time winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor, and who ultimately was selected to lead the coup, the 34 coup attempt against Roosevelt, because he was very critical of Roosevelt. Smedley Butler, however, was a true conservative, and he went along with the plotters and ultimately betrayed the coup to Roosevelt because he was appalled that they would attempt to circumvent the constitutional authority. Well, in 1931, Smedley Butler, in a speech, commented on a motor trip that Cornelius Vanderbilt, again part of the American elite, had undertaken in Italy with Mussolini. They were taking a motor tour of the Italian countryside, and Mussolini's car ran over and killed a young peasant girl and didn't even stop. I mean, it just ran her over and kept right on going. And Mussolini reportedly, according to the journalistic accounts of the day, turned to Vanderbilt and said, "Don't look back, Vanderbilt. What's one life in the affairs of the state?" Well, Smedley Butler, upon hearing of this in a public address, he branded Mussolini a wild, mad dog, unquote. And for that, court-martial proceedings were begun against Smedley Butler for slandering Mussolini. They were promptly interdicted because he had dirt on Herbert Hoover. When Smedley Butler had commanded an American unit during the Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the century, he had rescued the American compound from the Boxer rebels, and when he went in, he basically found Herbert Hoover, who was a young mining engineer, cowering in the corner and practically wetting his pants, which was very odd, the exact opposite of the image that Herbert Hoover had tried to perpetuate about himself, which was he was this big macho hero who basically stood on the flaming battlements and led the defense against the rebels. Nothing could be farther from the truth. He was looking for the exit, and when he couldn't find one, literally was discovered by the American troops who rescued the American legation. He was found literally cowering in a corner, just covering his head. And this basically, because he was able to verify this, that was the only reason that Smedley Butler was able to avoid a court-martial. Again, this guy's a two-time winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor. They tried to court-martial him for slandering Mussolini. This will give you an idea of just how favorably fascism was viewed in the United States. Another bellwether of that, there was an American left anarchist newspaper that was put out by an Italian-American named Carlo Tresca. It was very critical of the Mussolini dictatorship in Italy. In 1923, the Italian ambassador to the United States was addressing a number of American industrialists and financiers, including many key members of the Wall Street elite and the Morgan Industrial and Financial Group, one of who, I've forgotten the fellow's name offhand, but he was the CEO, what we now call the CEO of U.S. Steel, and he was made an honorary member of the Fascisti. He was made an honorary member of Mussolini's fascist party. The Italian ambassador to the U.S. suggested at a white-tie dinner and white tie and tails dinner in New York that the Americans should suppress Il Martello, this Italian-American newspaper, which was generating a lot of bad publicity for Mussolini among the Italian-American community in the United States. It was then promptly suppressed. A series series of illegal actions was taken against Il Martello. Its circulation was routinely interdicted. It was forced out of publication for a while for carrying an ad for a birth control device. Eventually, when Carlo Tresca got out of prison, he got out of the federal penitentiary for advertising birth control, which was illegal in the 1920s, or at least it was illegal if you were Carlo Tresca. He was then eventually assassinated by the mafia. And in fact, Carmine Galante, later one of the mafia capos of the New York City families, was the fellow who blew him away. At the behest of Mussolini, by the way. So this gives you an idea of how sympathetic Americans were to fascism. Now again, IT&T was one of the central elements in this German-American transatlantic industrial and financial axis, and it's something that's going to play a very prominent part in the story that's going to follow. Now I've digressed to a certain extent. We're in the mid-1920s. Germany is being recapitalized. The net effect of, on the one hand, the reparations payments which the Allies imposed on Germany at the Versailles Conference, and then on the other hand, the loans which were made not only to German industrial and financial institutions, but also to German municipal institutions. Basically, these were securities floated on the American capital market, was that Germany borrowed almost as much money abroad as they ultimately paid out in reparations. So the German reparations payments essentially involved sort of a capital merry-go-round, a transatlantic capital merry-go-round, where the American financial institutions loaned them capital. They then, the German, not only German governmental institutions, but German industrial and financial institutions, then paid out the reparations to the victorious Allies. It was sort of like a capital round robin. Ultimately, the net effect, as I said, of the reparations loans was to produce a concentration of German capital, and in particular the three giant cartels, United Steel or Vereinigte Stahlwerke, German General Electric, AEG, 30% owned by American GE, and also the consummately important IG Farben Company grew out of this recapitalization of Germany under the Dawes and Young plans. John Foster Dulles, fast rising partner with Sullivan and Cromwell, was the special counsel to the Dawes Committee, and Sullivan and Cromwell, in turn, handled much of the legal work with very generous fees going to the people involved for many of these corporations, IG Farben in particular. The connections between IG Farben and Sullivan and Cromwell were so profound that in his letters to the various IG executives, John Foster Dulles would start the correspondence with Heil Hitler. It's a very interesting salutation for an American corporate attorney and alleged patriot to begin his correspondence with. So this is the position in the mid-1920s. Now, another major epicenter in this developing old boy network, we should also note that Allen Dulles came on board at Sullivan and Cromwell at exactly this time. And Allen Dulles's expertise, his skill, this also had much to do, I think, with shaping the character of the CIA. Allen Dulles's main asset for Sullivan and Cromwell was that he was able to help Sullivan and Cromwell's clients circumvent U.S. government regulations. Basically, he was able to help them skirt the law. And I think, too, in some of the extra-legal machinations of the CIA in the post-World War II period, the Dulles expertise and its influence can be seen, because indeed one of the ways that the CIA has functioned in the post-World War II world, bear in mind again that the CIA is only a relatively small part of our intelligence system, is by circumventing American law. That the same sort of approach that many of these elite Wall Street lawyers took to law, and which Burton Hirsch correctly, in my opinion, extrapolated from into the way our intelligence system has developed. Because I think the specific functions of the CIA, not other U.S. intelligence agencies, but the CIA, do indeed derive their character from the way in which Wall Street lawyers and Wall Street law firms operate. And Allen Dulles and his expertise for Sullivan and Cromwell was in helping his clients circumvent American law. Basically, his main asset was in helping them get around the law. And I think much of the character of the post-World War II CIA could be said to show that kind of an influence as well. One of the major epicenters in, and here's that word again, the networking among the American elite, which was to result in the coalescing of the U.S. intelligence system, first and initially the COI, the Coordinator of Information. Also, you'll see that sometimes. I've seen it COI or OCI. That was the first World War II intelligence agency, later became the OSS under Wild Bill Donovan. But one of the epicenters that figures prominently in the networking which was to determine much of the character of not only the CIA but American civilian intelligence during and after World War II, was the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the 1930s. Now, Franklin Roosevelt was the president who established diplomatic relations with the former Soviet Union. The book, from a diplomatic standpoint, had been in the United States and among the American elite that we simply should not recognize the Soviets at all, that they simply shouldn't even be officially recognized. Roosevelt changed this policy because he simply didn't think it was realistic not to have diplomatic relations with one of the largest nations on earth, and a nation which, although governed by a social and political system that was anathema to the American elite and was certainly not democratic in any fashion, one which nonetheless was very influential. Roosevelt simply did not view this as a practical course of action. So Roosevelt established diplomatic relations with the former Soviet Union, and the first and most prominent of the American ambassadors to the Soviet Union was William Bullitt. William Bullitt was a strange fellow because he became an ardent anti-communist and Sovietophobe, yet in the mid-1920s he actually had sort of a, if not leftist leaning, he's sort of a bohemian character to much of what he did. He took up for a time with John Reed's widow, for example, and was part of cafe society in Greenwich Village, and actually had some fairly bohemian leanings during the 1920s. However, being a corporate climber, being part of the American elite, being a Philadelphia mainliner, and knowing above all else on which side his bread was buttered, William Bullitt ultimately metamorphosed into an ardent anti-communist and Sovietophobe, and he was appointed U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, on his staff, on William Bullitt's staff, were some key people who were later to figure in the post-World War II development of the American diplomatic and national security establishments. One of the main names is a fellow named George Kennan, Kennan, who later, as a key State Department operative, was to be the architect of the containment strategy. The containment strategy became the central anti-communist stratagem and the watchword of American strategic operations in Europe and around the world in the post-World War II period. George Kennan was one of the central functionaries for Department of State with the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the 1930s under William Bullitt. Now, again, bear in mind the term networking. Again, you talk about conspiracy, and people think, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. You talk about networking, again, they go, oh, yes, you mean network? You mean what I do at work? You mean what yuppies do? Oh, how nice. Isn't that delightful? Well, that's what we're looking at here. You can call it conspiracy theory, in which case everybody will turn up their nails and go, oh, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. Or you can talk about networking, which is really how these things operate. And that, I think, from a rhetorical standpoint, will create a much more understanding environment for anybody you're attempting to relate this information to. George Kennan was one of the major functionaries under William Bullitt in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the 1930s. Another of the people who is going to figure in our story later was a fellow named Carmel Offie. Now, this is a name you never hear, last name O-F-F-I-E. Offie was one of the major players, along with Frank Wisner, whose name we've already talked about and who we're going to come back to later, with the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC. This is officially a State Department body, but it worked with the fledgling CIA and other elements of our national security establishment to coordinate covert operations. And the two main people involved with the OPC, one of the central elements in the U.S. covert warfare establishment in the post-World War II period, along with Frank Wisner, was Carmel Offie. And Carmel Offie made his way, so to speak, within the American power establishment by basically doing William Bullitt's work for him. William Bullitt was overwhelmed by the workload at the U.S. Embassy. Carmel Offie, who was by all accounts a workaholic, handled much of the work for William Bullitt. And ultimately, Carmel Offie became one of the main functionaries of the U.S. covert establishment in the post-World War II period. Also became a focal point, ultimately, of Joe McCarthy's attacks as well. Exactly why is something of a matter of debate. One school of thought has it that Carmel Offie's homosexuality, which was well documented and for that period of history, the early 1950s, fairly flagrant. It's not meant to be morally judgmental, but if you were going to be a American mover and shaker in the early 1950s, and if you were gay, you had better keep your liaisons quite secret, and Carmel Offie was apparently fairly open about his homosexual relations. The American attitude was much more puritanical towards this. This is, again, something of a parenthetical aside, but an individual whose rhetorical career I greatly admire. His political career was checkered, but who also had a terrific sense of humor, and that was Winston Churchill. When he was, to give you an idea of the different attitudes on the part of the British and American establishments towards homosexuality, many people feel that McCarthy's persecution of Carmel Offee was because of his homosexuality, which was quite open for the day. In the pre-World War I period, Winston Churchill, who was then a member of Parliament, was approached by a fellow Tory, and apparently there was a conservative member of Parliament who'd been fairly open about his sexual liaisons with sailors in Hyde Park, and that this was causing something of a scandal. And a fellow Tory MP approached Winston Churchill about this fellow, whose name I forget offhand, and said, what should we do about this? I mean, everybody knows these guys basically boinking sailors in Hyde Park fairly openly. And so Churchill says, "Oh yes, so and so. You mean the fellow who's giving buggery a bad name?" That's sort of indicative of the different attitudes, which was fairly circumspect for a pre-World War I British Tory MP. But Carmel Offee, getting back to the main focus of the discussion, Carmel Offee was William Bullitt's right-hand man at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in this period of time, along with George Kennan, the architect of containment strategy, one of the major elements in American strategic operations in the post-World War II period. And these two men were networking at this time with a key Nazi diplomat, because Hitler was in power in Europe at this time, named Gustav Hilger, last name Hilger. Hilger became one of the main architects of the Nazi policy towards not only the Soviet Union but also Poland, which could be basically summed up in one word: murder. I mean, and actually two words: enslavement and murder. The Nazi policy towards the Slavic nations, whom they viewed as racially inferior, was one of absolute subjugation and eradication. And one of the major architects of this policy and one of its major implementers at the diplomatic level was Gustav Hilger, who should have been executed as a war criminal at the end of World War II. Instead, he was brought into the United States and was established at the very core of our national security establishment by George Kennan, who, again, became a key State Department official. Kennan's networking with Gustav Hilger and his esteem for Gustav Hilger was established in this period. So again, another of the epicenters of this networking that we're going to see, that we are seeing, hopefully, is in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the mid-1930s, when we have William Bullitt, who had attempted to work out this agreement with Lenin, which would have drastically altered the history of the 20th century, but he'd been overridden largely for selfish careerist reasons later. Later, William Bullitt, again knowing on which side his bread was buttered, professionally speaking, became an ardent anti-communist and was appointed to the ambassadorship to Moscow, largely for that reason. Again, this is in the 1930s, mid-1930s. Now we're going to jump up to World War II, which obviously is one of the major elements in this discussion. At the beginning of the Second World War, the U.S. had no formal civilian intelligence agency. When the U.S. entered World War II, the first civilian intelligence agency was the Coordinator of Information, of the Office of the Coordinator of Information. This was placed under the stewardship of William Wild Bill Donovan, again, who was a very successful corporate attorney. He was an assistant attorney general, and whatever Wild Bill Donovan's flaws were, and they were considerable, one thing I'd have to say for him, never met the man myself, but he was at loggerheads with Douglas MacArthur and also J. Edgar Hoover, so in my opinion, he couldn't have been all bad. But when he was Assistant Attorney General, he clashed with J. Edgar Hoover on a number of different aspects of the American legal policy. But Wild Bill Donovan basically was established by Franklin Roosevelt as the head of first the Office of Coordinator of Information, our first wartime intelligence service, which very quickly, after 11 months, gave rise to the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was America's World War II intelligence service, and was also inextricably linked in this period of time, and for quite a period of time after World War II, with British intelligence. Britain obviously was involved with the war against Germany well before the United States. Britain entered World War II in September of 1939. And, of course, the U.S. didn't enter the war till more than 2 years later when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. William Stephenson was dispatched by William Churchill to oversee all British secret intelligence in North America during World War II, both covert operations and the collection of intelligence. Very quickly, William Stephenson, codenamed Intrepid. In fact, there's a good book that you'll see called Codenamed Intrepid about Sir William Stephenson, spelled, by the way, Stephenson. I mentioned that because the author of the book, codenamed Intrepid, was also named William Stephenson, Stephenson, also a former British intelligence operative, although a Canadian native, Actually, I think the Intrepid was also originally a native of Canada. In fact, I know he was. They were both Canadian natives, and both William Stevenson with a P. He helped set up the Special Operations Executive, SOE, the British Covert Operations and Commando Operations. William Stevenson, STEV, at one point worked with that very same institution. But William Donovan and the fledgling U.S. intelligence apparat were in many ways not only shaped by, but it joined at the hip with British intelligence in North America, because the U.S. had essentially no covert operations experience. The British at this point were 2 years down the road in that particular regard. So when Wild Bill Donovan sets up the OSS, he did so in close cooperation with William Stevenson and British intelligence. British intelligence wielded a profound influence on the shaping of the U.S. intelligence apparatus during World War II, or at least U.S. civilian intelligence. We should note that in this time period, the rivalry between civilian intelligence and military intelligence was shaped. The U.S. military intelligence functionaries hated the OSS. The OSS was largely composed of Ivy Leaguers and members of the American elite, at least at its command level. This, to a certain extent, engendered the resentment of military intelligence, who also resented having their province encroached on by a bunch of Wall Street eliters. One American officer characterized the OSS as, quote, a bunch of faggots, unquote, and they were viewed with great disfavor by American military intelligence, and the rivalry between American military intelligence and our civilian intelligence agencies persisted up through the Cold War period and exists to this day. There's a lot of bitterness, for example, a lot of rivalry between ONI and CIA, although many operatives will work for both intelligence agencies. ONI veterans and partisans will tell you that the CIA gets its best people from ONI. But we should note that it is in this period in which the rivalry between military intelligence and civilian intelligence is hatched, and it has persisted to this day. In the Office of Strategic Services, again, America's World War II intelligence service, we see serving as functionaries people who were to be the prime movers and shakers of the CIA in the post-World War II period. Allen Dulles, again, a partner in Sullivan and Cromwell, about whom we'll have more to say in a few minutes, was a key OSS operative and basically was stationed at the Bern, Switzerland office of the OSS. The two other people who were key OSS operatives were Richard Helms and William Colby, all later directors of Central Intelligence. If you take a look at the OSS from 1954 through 1976, the CIA was headed up by OSS veterans. You had Allen Dulles from 54 through 61. Well, no, actually, with the exception of John McCone, who handled CIA for a period of time for John Kennedy. Later, Richard Helms succeeded to the directorship of CIA. He, in turn, was replaced by William Colby. They were all OSS veterans. Another key OSS veteran at this time was Frank Wisner, who was, again, a major corporate lawyer. He was one of the partners in Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. And again, when Frank Wisner became a deputy director of Central Intelligence, at one point they had two deputy DCIs who were both partners in Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, Harding Jackson and Frank Wisner. And again, when that overlapped with a period of time when you had John Foster Dulles at State and Allen Dulles as head of the CIA, the American elite, the Wall Street elite, these Wall Street lawyers and firms that I've been talking about, were never more visible in terms of their role as a fulcrum of power. Now, one of the major corporations, which was part of this transatlantic industrial and financial axis, and which is going to figure in a big way here, was the Stinnes firm. Hugo Stinnes was a German industrialist who had operations. He had more connections, as I like to say, than a switchboard, and he had a lot of American operations. The Stinnes firm was one of these corporations that was inextricably linked with the Wall Street power elite. It continued to operate throughout the course of World War II. In other programs, such as my interview with John Loftus for 2 hours, I've talked about how these same corporate connections continued to function throughout the course of World War II. The degree of continuity of these German-American and also British and American corporate connections would be really quite shocking to someone in this day and age. One of my favorites, and it's not a ha-ha favorite, but one of the most grotesque, but also to a certain extent amusing of these connections, concerns the IG Farben cartel agreements with Imperial Chemicals. One of the institutional lies which has been handed down was that Neville Chamberlain was hoodwinked by Hitler at Munich when he basically gave up first the Sudetenland and later all of Czechoslovakia. Nothing could be further from the truth. Neville Chamberlain was very consciously walking Nazi Germany east to basically try to precipitate a war which the American and British elites wanted between Germany and the former Soviet Union. He simply was not hoping that it was not planning on that war coming home to Britain as well. Neville Chamberlain was the political protege of Sir Montague Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England and who funded Adolf Hitler from the Bank of England directly. Neville Chamberlain was also a principal stockholder in Imperial Chemicals, the largest British chemical firm, which was also inextricably linked through cartel agreements with I.G. Farben. Those cartel agreements were so profound that during the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force was obliged to pay royalties to I.G. Farben for the tetraethyl lead and the high-octane aviation fuel that they were using to shoot down the Luftwaffe planes attacking Britain. That's how Byzantine and how profound some of these connections were. And the same thing was true in the United States. Standard Oil